everybody, welcome back to Anna Reads. Today's Disney bound is Sleeping Beauty. In case you couldn't tell, make it pink and make it blue. I've got my Coca-Cola, I've got A Beautiful Day, and I've got Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. Yesterday we started Unit 3. Yes, we did. Let's see there. Yep. Unit 3, Chapter 11, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, Chapter 11, Unit 3. Walt Disney realized that the creative energies of his young artists could not be satisfied by the grinding out of 8-minute gag-packed cartoons, nor was he content with the repetition of well-worn formulas for familiar characters. Besides, the economic basis for cartoon shorts was deteriorating, despite the continuing popularity of Mickey Mouse and the emergence of new Disney stars. Pluto the ingenuous hound, who first appeared in a Mickey Mouse The Chain Gang in 1930, the affable, dim-witted Goofy, who started in Mickey's Revue in 1932, the explosive Donald Duck, who made his debut in 1934 silly symphony The Wise Little Hen. The Depression had forced theaters to offer more and more entertainment to lure customers, and exhibitors had adopted the double feature, 2 full-length films on one bill. That meant there was little left in each theater's budget or running time for short subjects. Forgive me, I about blew my vocal cords out last night watching Mary Poppins with my dog. No, there is not video or photographic evidence of this. Despite the fact that Walt Disney cartoons drew more people to the movies than many features, oh, here comes Luther. Bookings for the cartoons became more difficult. At the same time, the cost of the cartoons continued to climb. There he is. Walt had long recognized the inevitability of the cartoon feature. All of his planning had aimed in that direction. Why are you wet? Oh God, ew. Walt had long recognized the inevitability of the cartoon feature. All of his planning had aimed in that direction, developing greater drawing skill with the art school, experimenting with color and photographic innovations, using the silly symphonies as proving ground for new techniques and themes. What did you just wipe on me, cat? In 1934, he decided it was time to move ahead on the feature. His decision was unilateral. Roy was acutely aware of the narrowing gap between the cost of cartoons and the fiscal returns, and he was alarmed by Walt's plan to spend perhaps $500,000 on a feature. Lily was apprehensive too, but Walt could not be dissuaded. He could never explain why he had chosen Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs for the first feature. He liked to recall how he, along with other Kansas City newsboys, had been invited in 1915 to the silent version of Snow White, starring Marguerite Clark, at the convention hall. The movie was projected on 4 screens in the huge auditorium, and from where he was sitting, Walt could watch 2 of them. It had been his most vivid early memory of attending the movies, but his choice of Snow White was more pragmatic than sentimental. He recognized it as a splendid tale for animation, containing all the necessary ingredients: an appealing heroine and hero, a villainess of classic proportions, the dwarves for sympathy and comic relief, a folklore plot that touched the hearts of human beings everywhere. Disney animators first learned of the project one evening when several of them returned from dinner at a cafe across Hyperion Avenue. They found Walt waiting for them, and he said, "Come on in the soundstage, I've got something to tell you." They followed him onto the bare stage, lighted by a single naked bulb, and they took chairs in a semicircle before him. He began to tell them the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, as it might be animated on the screen. He acted out each part. His eyebrows ascended as he mixed dread potions as the evil queen, his face beaming when he depicted the merry dwarfs. The performance took 2 hours, and at the end, when the prince's kiss awakened the sleeping Snow White, there were tears in the eyes of his listeners. "That's going to be our first feature," Walt announced. "I want to know how many of them fainted." He began by installing a small unit of storymen and artists in an office adjoining his. By late 1934, Walt's original story had been transferred into an outline of the characters and a suggested plot. Snow White was described in terms of Janet Gaynor, 14 years old, the prince an 18-year-old Douglas Fairbanks Jr. The queen received the most detailed description, a mixture of Lady... Can I say that? The lady in the Scottish play, and the big bad wolf. Her beauty is sinister, mature, plenty of curves. She becomes ugly and menacing with scheming and mixing her poisons. Magic fluids transform her into an old witch-like hag. Her dialogue and actions are over melodramatic, verging on the ridiculous. Walt recognized from the outset the difficulty of establishing 7 dwarfs, each with a recognizable and endearing quality. The solution was to name them for their most recognizable characteristics. The outline listed them with tentative names for all but one. Happy, a glad boy. Sentimental, addicted to happy proverbs. His jaw slips out of its socket when he talks, thus producing a goofy speech mannerism. Sleepy, Sterling Holloway, always going to sleep, always swatting at a fly on the end of his nose. Doc, the leader and spokesman of the dwarfs, pompous, wordy, great dignity. Feels his superiority, but is more or less of a windbag. Bashful. Has a high peaked skull, which makes him ashamed to take off his hat. Blushing, hesitating, squirmy, giggly. Jumpy. Joe Twerp. Like a chap in constant fear of being goosed. Nervous, excited, his words and sentences mixed up. Grumpy. Typical dyspeptic and grouch. Pessimist, woman-hater, the last to make friends with Snow White. Excuse me. 7th, deaf. Always listening intently. What? Happy. Quick movements, spry. Not sure how they plan to do both of those at the same time, but I'm sure that's the one who evolved into Dopey. Walt worked with the Snow White unit through 1935 while maintaining his supervision of the short cartoons. His seemingly limitless energies again faltered, and he complained of the same lack of concentration that had presaged his nervous breakdown in 1931. A doctor gave him injections for thyroid deficiency, and the treatment seemed to increase his nervousness. Roy perceived the danger signs in his brother, and he suggested, "Why don't we take the girls to Europe for a vacation? It's the 10th wedding anniversary for both of us, and I think Lily and Edna deserve it for putting up with us." Walt agreed, and the 4 Disneys embarked on a tour of England, France, Switzerland, Italy, and Holland. Sorry, I tried to say Switzerland and Italy as one word. I don't know how that happened. Walt in later years wrote to a friend about an incident on the trip. "My brother Roy and I were in London prior to going to Paris to receive a medal from the League of Nations for Mickey Mouse. Under much protest, being strictly the sports clothes type myself, we were persuaded to have morning suits made. Jared, Jason, do either one of you know what the heck a morning suit is? 'Cause I sure don't. We were told that other attire would be inappropriate since it was to be an important occasion with ambassadors and other dignitaries in attendance. The fitting itself was a picnic, with Roy's coat on me and mine on him, my pants on Roy and someone else's pants on me. The place was in a turmoil. Anyway, we went to the affair in Paris properly attired, only to find that everyone there had wanted the boys from Hollywood to feel at home, so they came in casual clothes. I haven't had the thing on since. Walt enjoyed driving through the places he had known as a Red Cross driver, including Strasbourg, where he was again fascinated by the mechanical figures that appeared at the striking of the town clock. He tried to gain entrance to the workings of the clock so he could see how it operated, but the local officials wouldn't allow it. Everywhere the Disneys went in Europe, they saw evidence of the appeal of the Disney cartoons. Crowds greeted them at the railway station. Reporters came to the hotels for interviews. In Rome, the Disneys were received by Benito Mussolini in his huge office. For Walt, the most significant part of his European trip was seeing a theater in Paris that played 6 of his cartoons and nothing else. That convinced him more than ever that audiences would accept and welcome a cartoon the length of a live-action feature. After 11 weeks abroad, Walt returned to the studio with renewed energy. When the doctor telephoned him to remind him of his thyroid injections, Walt told the secretary, "Tell him I'm cured. He can shoot those things in his own butt from now on." God, I wish audio files survived of these things. I really do. Walt was bristling with ideas after his European trip. He brought with him children's books with illustrations of little people, bees, and small insects, and he told his staff in a memo, "The quaint atmosphere fascinates me, and I was trying to think of how we could build some little story that would incorporate all of these cute little characters." In a long memo to Ted Sears and the story department on the day before Christmas 1935, Walt outlined a score of ideas for future cartoon subjects. Most of them were for silly symphonies, which afforded greater freedom in the choice of story material. But he also had ideas for Mickey Mouse, including a burlesque on Tarzan, with Mickey as the ape man, and have him live in the jungle with the wild animals for his friends. Having for the first time seen the cartoons in foreign lands, Walt observed, "The more pictures we can make without dialogue, the better it will be for our foreign market. We have to depend on the foreign market very strongly now on account of the necessity of having larger grosses. However, I wouldn't let this stand in the way of any good plot or idea that had dialogue in it." I love that his answer was always more art. Walt concluded the memo by urging improvement of the story department. Block quote, "Let's not take any Tom, Dick, or Harry that shows up. Let's be very discriminating about it. See if we can't really find someone who has the qualifications. How about this fellow in Portland who sent in the Lion and Mouse story? Have you heard any more about him? Let's try to make arrangements with the people. Get them in here and let's try them out." I honestly feel that the heart of our organization is the story department. We must have good stories. We must have them well worked out. We must have people in there who can not only think up ideas, but who can carry them through and sell them to the people who have to do with the completion of the thing. The only way we can develop this story department is by starting in and trying to find these people. Then we must get them in and try them out. We must try to develop them. If they don't prove up, we must get rid of them before it is too late. We don't want the place cluttered up with a lot of people who are only so-so. I also feel that the story department is one of our weakest spots today when it should be one of our strongest. I think you should make a drive to get more gag men like Harry Reeves and Roy Williams, men who can really produce something. Only, if it is possible, We must get gagmen who have a little more feeling for situation gags, for personality gags, and who have a little showmanship in their system. They might develop into men who will be capable of carrying a story through to completion. Walt started to grapple with the technical problems of the feature he envisioned. Only the most caricatured of human figures had been portrayed in the Disney cartoons. More realistic drawing would be needed to establish the credibility of Snow White and the Prince. An attempt had been made in a 1934 silly symphony, The Goddess of Spring, to portray Persephone as a realistic girl, a prototype for Snow White. I've seen bits and pieces of that, and her movement is like what I would imagine Isadora Duncan looked like. The result was unconvincing, but Walt was not discouraged. "We'll get it next time," he assured the animators. The solution, he decided, was to photograph a girl in actions such as would be needed in the film. A young Los Angeles dancer, Marjorie Belcher, known later as Marge Champion, was hired to walk and spin and dance before the camera, and her movements provided keys for the animators to follow. Another problem was the essential flatness of the animated film. Audiences would accept the cavortings of two-dimensional pigs and wolves against painted backgrounds for an 8-minute span, but 80 minutes would emphasize the artifice of the animation process. The answer was the multiplane camera. It developed into a towering device, with a camera pointed downward through 4 or 5 layers of paintings. The various levels depicted planes of vision, and the lens focus could be moved through the planes, creating the same effect of a moving camera in live action. Again, Walt used the silly symphony as testing ground for the multiplane camera. It was first employed in The Old Mill. I have very little recollection of The Old Mill as a short, other than the music made me cry. I'm sure that's Frank Churchill's fault. And I'm sure my dad's up there having him a new one for making his little girl cry. Walt described the short as just a poetic thing, nothing but music, no dialogue or anything. The setting of an old mill at sunset, the cows going home, and then what happens in the old mill at night. Oh, for Pete's sake, I haven't even seen the thing since I was 5. The spider coming out and weaving its web, the birds nesting, and then the storm coming up and the old mill going on a rampage. And with the morning, the cows coming back, the spider web was all shattered and all that. It was just a poetic thing. Heavens, it's barely noon and I feel like I should have put some rum in this. I'm joking, of course. The Old Mill was an exceptional success, winning critical praise and an Academy Award. It showed the Disney artists what could be accomplished in terms of mood and visual imagery. You know, I've got a little story of my own about the multiplane camera. I've mentioned I am in background acting, and usually I wear Mickey Mouse earrings. A fellow background artist on a set that I was on got in my face and just started saying awful, hateful things about Disney. And I turned around and I said right to his face, "Well, you can thank that mouse for your job. We all can. Because without Walt's multiplanar camera, film as we know it would not exist, especially with the marriage of CGI and live action. Without that step, that multiplanar camera that's still patented to W.E. Disney, none of us in the film industry, especially here in Atlanta area, you know, the Georgia film market, all those jobs that have been created, all of those jobs you can credit right to this mouse right here. And if you fellow background artists are watching these videos, yes, I just called you out." The work on characters and story for Snow White continued. Jumpy was renamed Sneezy, and the unnamed dwarf became a dim-witted mute. His name was the last to evolve. Walt advocated dopey, but others objected that it sounded too modern and connoted narcotic addiction. Did any of y'all know that context? Because I certainly didn't. Matter of fact, the only thing I can think of is one of the boys in Going My Way, featuring Bing Crosby and Barry Fitzgerald. Don't smack me around like that, you make me dopey. But that's the only other context I can think of. Walt discovered that the word had appeared in Shakespeare, and he decreed that the seventh dwarf would be called Dopey. I love it when Shakespeare wins you an argument. His clarity of vision can be seen by his comments in story conferences during the preparation of Snow White. Walt had prudently begun the practice of having a secretary make verbatim transcripts of the conferences. Unnamed secretary, whoever you are, thank you, thank you, thank you. You have provided such a just invaluable primary source material. Snow White is visited in the cottage by the queen in her witch's disguise. Here we have a block quote. At the time the menace comes in, Snow White should be doing something that shows she is happy and that she is trying to do something nice for these little men. That's the time the menace should strike. It's most powerful when it strikes when people are happy. It's dramatic. He's not wrong. She's taken aback when she first sees the queen. She doesn't suspect the queen, but there's a lunatic around somewhere and he approaches you. You have that funny feeling. It's nothing that you can put your finger on. You wouldn't have the police come, but you'd be on your guard. Listen to your gut. Listen to your gut. I cannot stress that enough. Listen to your gut. It is there to keep you safe. That's the point we ought to bring out with the animals. They are dumb, but they have a certain sense like a dog who knows that somebody is not a friend. Did you just show up on cue? You just showed up on cue, you filthy, hairy thing. Yes, yes, yes. And the Academy Award for Animal Sidekick goes to whatever the hell you are. Get your butt out of my book. When the birds see that old witch, they know that everything is not right and they're alarmed and back out of the way. Retreat quietly. It has just dampened everything. But when the birds see the vultures that have followed her, that tells them something that even a human wouldn't recognize. Now, I have a very strong bond with vultures myself, and I can tell you, if you've got something deceased that vultures won't touch, salt it and bury it, because that thing is gross. Like, it's probably diseased. Salt it, quicklime it, bury it, get rid of it before it can spread anything. Conclusion. Fade in on her in the glass coffin, maybe shaded by a big tree. It's built on sort of a little pedestal. Torches are burning. 2 dwarfs on either side with things like guards would have. Others are coming up and putting flowers on the coffin. It's all decked with flowers. The birds fly up and drop flowers. Goodness sakes, what is going to happen to my mascara? Shots of the birds show them sad. Snow White is beautiful in the coffin. I don't even have a Kleenex close by, and I'm not blowing my nose on the cat. Then you hear the prince, the birds, dwarfs, everyone hear him off screen. As they turn to look, he is silhouetted against the hill on his horse. As he walks down the hill singing the song, cut to Snow White in the coffin. As he approaches, everyone sort of steps back as if he had a right there. He goes up to the coffin and finishes the song. As he finishes the song, he lifts the glass lid of the coffin, and maybe there's a hesitation. Then he kisses her. From the kiss, he drops down and buries his head in his hands in a sad position, and all the dwarves see it, and every dwarf drops his head. You know, I haven't even watched this film since I was about 12. All the animals are sad, but then Snow White begins to wake up like she's coming out of a sleep and begins to sit up. Nobody notices at first. One dwarf looks up and sees it, takes it, then several of them take it maybe. She sits up. The prince comes back and sees it. He springs to his feet. The music begins to pick up. The birds take it and go crazy. Hug each other. As he carries her along, they are all happy, following along. The music gets bright. The birds and animals are cutting capers. Excuse me. Make yourself useful. Oh. I'm only a little sorry, okay? All right. Oh, phooey, pull yourself together. Nothing will put you back together like a snoot full of cat hair, I guess. Storymen and animators made contributions at the conferences, but it was always Walt's voice that dominated, suggesting camera angles, indicating moods, and most valuable of all, acting out his concept of the dialogue and action. And oh my goodness, I have melted like the Witch of the West here. Oof, excuse me. Oh, normally I would not groom so, but goodness gracious, I've messed myself up. Sometimes he made contributions from his own experience. In 1936, he was invited to the annual encampment of the Bohemian Club, a San Francisco organization of artists and civic figures. The ritual consisted of whining, feasting, and camping out in a redwood grove north of San Francisco Bay. When Walt returned to the studio, he complained of being unable to sleep because of the symphony of snores in nearby tents. He described and reproduced each of the snores to the hilarity of his storymen. You know, I had a beagle for 15 years, and by the time she was 3, she was a prolific sawer of logs. The result was the snoring sequence in the dwarf's cottage. I have no memory of that. Like I said, I haven't seen the film in years. I need to go watch it again. As always, Walt paid close attention to the music. Except for an abortive attempt at learning the violin as a boy, he had no real experience with music. Ugh, I had the same experience with a clarinet. Yet he had an uncanny knack for picking music that would appeal to the public. He liked melody, and he preferred music that wasn't too loud or too high-pitched. Composers and arrangers learned not to use piccolos in Disney scores. Early attempts at Snow White songs did not please him. He complained that they followed the pattern of Hollywood musicals, which introduced songs and dances at regular intervals without regard to the progression of the story. Excuse me. We should set a new pattern, a new way to use music, he argued. Weave it into the story so somebody doesn't just burst into song. Oh my God, Walt Disney started the meme about the first person to question why everyone's singing. I think that's the best thing I've ever heard. Nor was Walt satisfied with the voices that he auditioned for the role of Snow White. His office was connected to the soundstage by wire so he could listen to auditioning singers. None possessed the childlike quality Walt was seeking. And I think that's a genius move right there. Remove the auditioning singers from Walt's line of sight because he was looking for a particular sound and there could be no visual bias there. One day, his talent man assured him that the next candidate would be perfect. She was a 14-year-old with a bell-like soprano. Walt listened and commented, "She's too mature. She sounds between 20 and 30. The girl was Deanna Durbin." I don't know if that's supposed to mean something. Finally, Walt heard a voice that made him say, "That's the girl. That's Snow White." She was 18-year-old Adriana Casalotti, who had been family trained in Italian opera. The small unit working next to Walt's office was joined by other animators and background artists until by the spring of 1936, the feature cartoon occupied the talents of virtually everyone in the studio. Making of the shorts continued since they sustained the flow of much-needed cash, but the real sense of pioneering excitement centered on Snow White, and each breakthrough in technique and character delineation was greeted like a new weapon in a holy war. You know, a little side note about Adriana Casalotti and myself. Without telling you my age, I did not find out until I was a grown person that Adriana Casalotti had passed away about a week before I was born. And this adds to my brother's running joke that my year of birth is bookended by the release of 2 Disney animated feature films, one the year before, one the year after. And Jareth has said, "We didn't get a Disney film that year. Disney got you." Naturally, I burst into tears in the middle of the Magic Kingdom. I don't know if you've noticed, but I kind of do that a lot. Cat hair. Moving on. Cat hair, moving on. Walt was selecting his animators with the same thoughtful care that another film producer would exercise in choosing human actors for an all-star movie. Freddie Moore, Bill Tytla? 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 I don't know. Fred Spencer and newcomer Frank Thomas proved to be the animators who could instill humor and individual characteristics in the dwarfs. Norm Ferguson superbly I've never experienced this word before, so I learned it by reading, don't judge me. Limned, the menace of the witch. Ham Lusk. I'm not having a good pronunciation day, apparently. Ham Luska accepted the formidable challenge of making Snow White move with human grace. Grim Natwick also contributed to Snow White and animated the prince, the least successful of the human figures. I read in a Life magazine feature about Walt Disney that he found the prince and most men boring to animate. Snow White's animal friend. Snow White's animal friends were entrusted to 3 young artists: Milt Kahl, he'll come up later, don't bite me, Eric Larson, and Jim Alger. Ouch! Bitch. Excuse my language. All of the animators and background artists, too, drew inspiration from the preliminary sketches of Albert Herter and Gustav Tengren, whose European origins and training helped provide the flavor and mood of a fairy tale. What the heck did you scratch me for? The controlling hand of Walt Disney followed every phase of production. He realized the need to test each sequence as it was developed, and the story sketches were filmed on a Leica reel, as the rough sequences had come to be called, so it could be judged before being committed to the final process of animation. These were viewed in the sweatbox by Walt, by supervising director Dave Hand, and by the individual sequence directors Bill Cottrell, Wilfred Johnson, Ben Sharpstein, Larry Morey, and Percy Pierce. Walt also looked at reels of rough animation known as pencil tests. He screened preliminary footage for many of the creative workers, and they were asked to respond to short questions such as, does any section seem too long or too short? Did any of the business strike you as being objectionable? Were there any spots where the audience would laugh at the wrong time? Do you recall any gags where you thought the point was missed? Is the personality of each character consistent? For everyone out there who is a creator, a maker, a writer, those are excellent questions to continue with to this day. As each sequence was approved for production, new ones were being prepared. Almost every working day through the last half of 1936 and into 1937, Walt held story conferences with members of his staff. A storyboard meeting on November 24, 1936, concerned the scene of the witch preparing the poisoned apple. Walt, the thought just struck me on the build-up of the music to where she says, "Now turn red," etc., that where it starts you might go into innocent, sweet music while she is saying something about how innocent it looks. The music changes as the apple changes, and it could stay that way until she says, "Have a bite." It would be a good contrast. Hand, you mean the innocence of the apple or of Snow White? Walt, the apple. You have seen the poison seeping into it and the build-up on the hocus-pocus around it. Then some innocent little theme here, coming back to the heavy music after she says, "Have a bite." Richard Creedon, admiring the apple as if she'd like to eat it herself, pink as a maiden's blush. Walt, something to show how tempting the apple is, how tempting it would be to anybody she offered it to. Bill Cottrell, wouldn't you want that when you are back on her? She even goes sweet herself. She'd change her personality into the peddler woman, then look over at the raven for, "Have a bite?" Walt, it would just be part of her sales talk here. The apple has just changed from this terrible thing in blowfly colors and the skull to a beautiful red. There wouldn't really be too much of it, just enough for contrast. Ferguson, would it be too much of a burlesque on her if when she said, "I'll be the fairest in the land," she started to pretty up, fixing her hair? Walt, why not? She's clowning. Take that attitude with her in it. Walt's initial estimate of $500,000 for Snow White proved absurdly low. It was going to cost 3 times that amount. United Artists executives exhibited little enthusiasm for the project, and influential figures throughout the film industry doubted the wisdom of the Disney experiment with a feature cartoon. Walt learned that it was being called Disney's Folly, and there were predictions that Snow White would sink him into bankruptcy. He expressed his concern about the negative publicity to Hal Horn, the exploitation manager of United Artists who had first recognized the worth of the 3 Little Pigs. Horn had become a good friend of the Disney studio, and Walt often sought his advice. "What should I do about all this bad talk about the feature?" Walt asked. "Nothing," Horn replied. "Keep them wondering. Let 'em call it Disney's Folly or any other damn thing, as long as they keep talking about it. The picture is going to pay off, and the more suspense you build up, the more it'll pay off." Not all of the important people in the film industry lacked faith in Snow White. W.G. van Schmoes, who managed the nation's largest movie theater, the Radio City Music Hall, had long been friendly with the Disneys and paid the highest rental for the Mickeys and the Symphonies. Whenever he came to Hollywood, he paid a call to the Disney studio. Walt showed him the work in progress on Snow White, and von Schmoes was impressed. "Walter, it'll be a success," he said. "I'll book it for the music hall." Encouragement also came from Walter Wanger, a distinguished producer who played polo with Walt and Roy. Wanger assured Joseph Rosenberg, the Bank of America executive who supervised loans to Walt Disney Productions, "Joe, if Walt does as well on the feature as he has done with everything else he's made, the public will buy it." Still, Rosenberg retained a banker's normal caution. When Roy asked for more money to complete Snow White, Rosenberg was reluctant. Roy advised Walt, "You've got to show Joe what you've done on the picture so far." "I can't do that," Walt insisted. "All I've got is bits and pieces. You know I never like to show anybody a picture when it's all cut up. It's too dangerous." "Walt, you'll have to," Roy replied. "The only way we're going to get more money is to show them what they're lending money for." Walt grudgingly agreed. He ordered his staff to work overtime to prepare a presentation that contained the essential elements of Snow White. Since only a few of the sequences had been completed, the action had to be bridged by pencil sketches and rough layout. Finally, enough film was collected to provide a rough impression of Snow White, and Walt arranged to show it to Rosenberg at the studio on a Saturday afternoon. Only the two men were present in the projection room. The room darkened, and on the screen came the scene of a fairy tale book opening. What followed was a jumble of fully animated sequences in color, alternating with long stretches of penciled sketches of static figures. The soundtrack was fragmentary, and Walt filled in the gaps with his own recital of the dialogue and action. Despite Walt's energetic performance, Rosenberg's response was only an occasional, "Yes, yes." Finally, the showing ended with Snow White and the Prince living happily ever after. The lights came on in the projection room, and Walt searched the banker's face for a sign of approval. There was none. Walt followed him out the door, down the studio street, and into the alley where Rosenberg's car was parked. Rosenberg talked about Roy, the weather, anything except what he had just seen in the projection room. He climbed in the car, started the motor, and said, "Thanks, goodbye." Then he added, "That thing is going to make a hatful of money." With financing assured, production on Snow White accelerated. Artists worked uncomplainingly on Saturdays and Sundays, and at night, too. All were imbued with the crusade-like... What's all that? Some bird. Must you? All were imbued with the crusade-like mission to make the first feature cartoon a success. Only one negative note appeared. Among the written responses to a showing of partly finished film was an anonymous "Stick to shorts." Walt was upset for days. Years afterward, whenever an employee responded negatively to a Disney idea, he pointed a finger and exclaimed, "I'll bet you're the guy that wrote Stick to Shorts." As Snow White was being completed, the Disneys came to the end of their association with United Artists. They had been dissatisfied with the distributor's terms, and the proposals for a new contract offered little improvement. United Artists insisted on the television rights to the Disney cartoons, and Walt refused to part with them. "I don't know what television is, and I'm not going to sign away anything I don't know about." Smart man, he reasoned. RKO offered much more favorable terms, and the Disneys signed a releasing agreement for the shorts and for Snow White. Excuse me, I don't normally touch my face this often, but there's cat hair stuck to every inch of it. The studio was racing for a Christmas release of Snow White, but when Walt reviewed a nearly completed version of the film, he noticed something disturbing. When the prince leaned over to kiss Snow White in her glass coffin, he shimmied. Something had gone wrong in the camera work or the animation. "I want to make it over," Walt announced to Roy. "How much will it cost?" Roy asked. Walt announced that it would require several $1,000s. "Forget it," said Roy, who had borrowed all he could. "Let the prince shimmy." And ever afterward he did. I would love to see that in one of the face characters. The sales force of RKO began discussions on how to sell the film. One of the distribution executives told Walt, "We've got to play down the fairy tale angle." When Walt asked why, the man replied, "Because audiences don't buy fairy tales. We've got to sell it as a romance between the prince and Snow White and play down the dwarfs. We can simply call it Snow White." "No, it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs," Walt insisted. "It's a fairy tale. That's what I put $1.5 million into, and that's the way it's going to be sold." Finally, on December 21st, 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was seen by the public in a glittering premiere at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. The great names of Hollywood and the leaders of the film industry stepped out of their limousines to praise Walt Disney on the radio. Inside the Carthay Circle, they laughed at the floppy antics of Dopey, and some cried when the dwarves found Snow White in a death-like sleep. When the movie ended, the audience stood and cheered. Many years later, Walt reminisced in wonderment. "All the Hollywood brass turned out for my cartoon. That was the thing. And it went way back to when I first came out here and I went to my first premiere. I'd never seen one in my life. Saw all these Hollywood celebrities coming in, and I just had a funny feeling. I just hoped that someday they'd be going into the premiere of a cartoon, because people would depreciate the cartoon. You know, they'd kind of look down. I met a guy on the train when I was coming out. It was one of those things that kind of made you mad. I was out on the back platform. I was in my pants and coat that didn't match, but I was riding first class. I was making conversation with a guy who asked me, "Going to California?" "Yeah, I'm going out there." "What business you in?" I said, "The motion picture business." Then all of a sudden, "Oh, is that right? Well, I know somebody in the picture business. What do you do?" I said, "I make animated cartoons." Oh. It was like saying I sweep up the latrines. Sometimes people make you mad and you want to prove something to them even though they mean nothing to you. I thought of the guy on the back platform when we had the premiere of Snow White, and the darn thing went out and grossed $8 million around the world. From everything I've read, I can't think of anything that's truer Walt Disney than that. And that's the end of Unit 3, Chapter 11 of Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas. I think I may spend this evening rewatching Snow White if I don't get distracted and do something else. But the pandemic goes on. Hopefully we're closer to everything slowly and in a staggered, measured manner reopening. Remember, we're all here with each other and for each other. Take good care of yourself. Take good care of your friends and family. Take good care of annoying cats who turn up and try to spoil your reading videos. And I guess there's nothing else to say, but now it's time to say goodbye to all our company. Can't have my hand back, can I? M-I-C, see you real soon. K-E-Y. Why? Because we like you. M-O-U-S-E. Stay strong, everybody. Have courage and be kind.